Let me just show you some things. This is a sermon from the Reverend Samuel Cooper. He was a famous evangelist from the First Great Awakening. Well, there was a young boy that used to follow the Reverend Samuel Cooper around, and he loved the Reverend Samuel Cooper, and that young boy was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams went on to become the 6th President of the United States. Well, this is the book that John Quincy Adams wrote, and he wrote actually to his 10-year-old son to show his son how to study the Bible and get the most out of the Bible. As president, people realized what he'd done and said, hey, can we reprint that? We want our sons, we want our kids to know what you think they need to know to get the most out of the Bible. Well, this is the president who loved the Bible, wanted people to know about the Bible. Another pastor who had a huge influence in the First Great Awakening was the Reverend George Whitefield. These actually are a couple of his original sermons from the First Great Awakening, which is really cool. There was a man whose life was shaped by the Reverend George Whitefield. Actually, this man signed the peace treaty that ended the revolution. It was Elias Boudinot. Well, Elias Boudinot, after the revolution, helped form the very first Bible society in America called the American Bible Society. That society still exists today. They print over 250 million Bibles a year to give to people that don't have Bibles. Well, this is one of the very first Bibles printed under Elias Boudinot from the American Bible Society, this president of Congress whose life was shaped after he had been baptized by the Reverend George Whitefield. Well, this was a great awakening preacher whose practical influence really changed and shaped the life of someone that made a major impact in America. The Reverend Gilbert Tennent. He was someone who actually pastored church in Philadelphia at the time. Well, there was a young boy who grew up to become a founding father, but as a young boy actually studied under the Reverend Gilbert Tennent, and that was Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration, helped ratify the Constitution, but he was also known as the father of public schools under the Constitution. And this is actually a book full of his essays that he wrote, and actually some of the essays he wrote was for education in America. So we would know the way school ought to function and operate now that we'd become a nation. See, the First Great Awakening wasn't just about spiritual impact, it was very practical, very real and relevant. Well, one of the most famous orators, in fact known as the best pulpit speaker in the entire First Great Awakening, really in all of America, was the Reverend Samuel Davies. This is actually a sermon from the Reverend Samuel Davies, and really cool what the Reverend Samuel Davies did. He actually was talking about George Washington and how George Washington was a hero in the faith of George Washington. Because he was such a great orator, there was a young boy that traveled and wanted to learn from the Reverend Samuel Davies. Think of the guy that gave this famous speech about give me liberty or give me death. It was Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry grew up under the Reverend Samuel Davies. We actually have a document signed by Governor Patrick Henry. Well, Patrick Henry, very well known for his speech, his stance on freedom and liberty. Well, he had learned this from a pastor from the First Great Awakening, and most people today don't see the connection that spiritual emphasis that revivals have in very practical application. But the First Great Awakening helped shape education in America, helped shape business and medicine and law and government and politics. We understood that the spiritual has a very real and practical connection, and that's something that we ought to understand and once again apply our faith to today so that our faith can be relevant and make a difference in the world around us. Hey guys, welcome back to the One Room Schoolhouse. We are this week talking about the providence of God in American history, specifically in military situations. Because of that, we are joined by special guest Lieutenant Colonel Brian Birdwell, retired, now a Texas State Senator, and definitely has some military experience, has lots of insight, lots of stories. Some are probably more family friendly than others, and some of the things you know.
No, wait a minute. We didn't talk about anything off camera that wasn't family friendly.
Not this time, but.
Okay.
I have brothers in the military, I have cousins in the military, and there's a lot of intense moments and some very. As a guy, we love hearing those stories.
War is hours and hours of boredom interspersed with seconds of sheer panic. Is what war is.
That is a great description in the midst of it. So we're going to look for a few minutes at one of the moments when there was maybe not hours of boredom, hours of cold, not a lot of pleasure, and then a few moments of intense action. The Battle of Trenton, which is where the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware is on the way to the Battle of Trenton. I actually think there's a foam board of it down there. Of Washington crossing the Delaware, and a few significant people that are there in the boat with him. One of them, the guy holding the flag, is future President of the United States. Who is that, Jonathan?
Monroe, James Monroe.
James Monroe, okay. We've been working on that. Sometimes Jonathan gets confused on who that is. But yeah.
Well, you know, presidents that start with an M, Madison, Monroe.
You can call it Madison.
They're like the same guy. I don't know.
Okay, so this was kind of unique because this happened on Christmas Day. And in America, the two greatest holidays it seems like we celebrate the most are the 4th of July and Christmas. So it seems really weird that one of Washington's biggest invasions and excursions would happen on Christmas Day?
Yeah, but does he not like Christmas or something?
You have to have a historical time out here, because what happened was
I get put in those a lot.
yeah, we are. We're putting that in. Up in the New England area particularly, where you had it was founded by a lot of what they called dissenters. And dissenters were those who objected to the state church. They did not like the state church of Europe, whether it was whether it was the Catholic Church of Italy or whether it was the Anglican Church of Great Britain. Anywhere that the government had established a national church, they didn't like that. And so what happens is those that come to America, particularly New England, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, they objected to state churches, which meant we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, essentially. So in the state churches, whether it was Anglican or Catholic, Christmas was a super huge holiday, really big deal. And these guys said, we don't want to be like them. So literally, in states like Massachusetts, it was illegal to celebrate Christmas. I think it was after the Civil War before they repealed that law.
Yeah, I think Connecticut was another place where we're not going to celebrate Christmas.
Man, talk about a war on Christmas.
Different kind of war on Christmas, yeah.
When you're down in the Anglican areas like South Carolina, Virginia, Washington, those guys celebrated Christmas because they were Anglicans, and that's what Great Britain was. But in New England, where this battle is occurring, no, we're not celebrating Christmas. So we don't do that.
On Christmas Day, 1776, Washington loads up with men, and they're going to go on this surprise attack. And it was significant because Washington knew he had to build some momentum in what they were doing.
I mean, you've got to build the support, because people want to reinforce success, not reinforce failure. And so it wasn't so much that Christmas Day was chosen for the nature of the holiday, but the enlistments of his men are going to expire at close of business on December 31st. So he's got 7 days to change the war narrative.
And up to this point, they've been losing every battle. I mean, we're just not having anything. So why would somebody re-enlist? Why would you go back up when you're on the losing side of every battle? You know, we talked even earlier about what happened in New York, where they retreated and took God's intervention to save the army. So you're right, enlistments are up, and why would you join a losing thing? And Washington's got to turn that around. He's got to change that.
So his idea is, let's go up to Trenton. There's a Hessian force, and this being kind of the German hired mercenaries by the British to come help be their allies to overcome the American patriots. And so the Hessians have roughly 1,500 that are stationed up in the Trenton area. And so Washington says, okay, if we get a bunch of our guys, we'll go at Christmas time, and we'll go through the night. We'll cross over, the Delaware. We'll do what we have to do. We'll get there. We probably will have superior force. We probably can take them without too much of a conflict, and maybe it'll boost morale enough that people will re-enlist, and then this struggle for liberty, the struggle for freedom can go on. Probably some of the presumable thoughts. Now, I imagine there are times in the military when you make plans, and then sometimes you encounter the situation and you go, we might need to change this plan. This is a pretty bad idea right now. Washington makes this plan and a blizzard shows up. Okay, so I'm not a military guy.
Now, hang on a second. Already, we're talking Christmas time in the New England area, which is not a warm time anyway. So already to have all your soldiers out there, about 1,000 soldiers are going to be crossing on these boats, and you're crossing and there is ice in the river, and it's already super cold anyway, that's not a comfortable position in which to be fighting, because you got to march for hours to get to Trenton after you cross the river. It's all bad. But then, as you say...
Yeah, I think I'd be protesting this as a soldier. I mean, obviously, officers, you're weighing this, but I'm like, excuse me, guys. It's snowing really, really a lot right now. Could we go tomorrow, wait a few days?
Yeah, this is where the staff weather officer gets hung for the wrong forecast. No, you're right. I mean, weather always has a major implication. It's exactly why Eisenhower made the decision he did, was a weather decision for June 6th, a period of fair to marginal conditions or wait for perfect. I don't have time to wait for perfect.
Right.
As far as the morale, this is equivalent to the Doolittle raid. We had just had Pearl Harbor, major detriment. The carriers, by God's providence, were not at Pearl Harbor that day, the primary, but we've got to do something to tell the Japanese, we are not going to sit here. We're going to come to you. Our spirit is not broken. We're going to win this thing, and to raise the morale of the American people. And so you had the Doolittle raid. So in some ways, this is the same parallel.
So Washington's put in a place where they have to make a decision. And so they decide, we're going, blizzard and all, we're going to go marching through, and we're going to Trenton. Now, the blizzard is one of what we would now look back consider a providential thing.
Now, hang on, before you do that, let me explain how bad the blizzard was, because you already got snow falling. In the middle of this blizzard, a hailstorm goes with it, and so they're getting pounded by hail. They also got lightning, and it's a thunderstorm in the middle of a blizzard, and it's crazy, and it's so bad
I didn't
that
know that was possible.
It is possible. And that's what's so weird. It was so bad that 2 of the Americans froze to death on the march.
Wow.
Now, how you're marching and freeze to death, I mean, that is rough conditions. When you're on the march and you freeze to death on the march, but the weather was so bad that the Hessians said, nobody's going to come in weather like this. Let's pull all of our sentries back inside. And they pulled every sentry off. There was nobody there to even see the Americans coming. It was bad for the Americans, and from the American side, it can't get much worse, but there's more to come.
Yeah, so one of the providential accounts also entails that there's an account that during the march, as the Americans were going by apparently a house, some dogs started barking, and it was a doctor's house. The doctor comes out to see what's going on.
And he's irate, right? It's the middle of the night. He just got woken up, so he comes
because
out.
they're marching from like 2 to 4 in the morning. They want to be there at sunrise at the British place.
So he comes out and he's just irate, starts yelling at the soldiers, and then he realizes that they're Americans and he's actually a patriot. And he looks at it, he recognizes that something's happening, and he says, look, I know something's about to happen. I'm going to be a part of it. I'm going to go with you guys into this battle because I'm a doctor and I might be able to provide some help. And he actually...
Who is he talking to?
The officer that he's talking to is James Monroe. Nailed it. James Monroe, which will become significant later once they get to Trenton. So this doctor comes, grabs his bag, I sure hope puts on a coat, and starts walking with the army into Trenton. And then they get there and it all hops off pretty fast, right?
Yeah, and actually the conflict only lasts, they say, roughly 45 minutes. I don't know that somebody had a stopwatch timing it, but we know it was quick, right? This was not a long endeavor that happened.
And you can imagine when 1,000 troops show up where there's 1,500, but you guys are not expecting anyone, you didn't know anybody was coming. I mean, that's...
I want to add just a personal experience, how hard this is. One of the most difficult operations is an opposed river crossing. And that's functionally what's happening here. 2, in my 18 months in Korea, I went through 2 Korean winters. A lot of road marches, and there comes a point that you can't stop because stopping is more painful. Your feet hurt. I mean, I've had my canteen frozen. I mean, I can imagine that's what's happening here. I mean, you are so cold that your functional ability to not just move is compromised. But when you get to where you're moving to now be able to conduct the operation. I mean, this is a level of rigor that is arduous. And you've got to appreciate that. I mean, I've done the road marches in Korea in January. And as a Texas kid, I mean, I've never been so cold in my life. But you've got to understand what cold does. And in the pre-industrial revolution of black powder weapon systems, you know, we're not talking, you know, brass casings that are reliable. I mean, the effect of weather on animals, the effect of weather on humans, and the effect of weather on equipment is overwhelmingly austere here.
So really difficult situation, right? As we read it, we kind of get a feel for it being tough, but I mean, marching Korean winters, I can only imagine, right? That sounds miserable. That was always my thought, even from the Korean War, hearing some of those accounts of the guys who didn't have the proper clothing and equipment, which actually sounds much more like what would have been the American situation, not really having the technology, even with winter garments that we have today. So very difficult situation for Washington and his army. They show up. The battle does not last very long. Several Hessians are killed, but they end up capturing like 900 Hessians. The only Americans who lost their lives were the 2 that froze to death during the march. There were several that were wounded. Providentially, right? the doctor happens to be there as some of these guys are wounded. Well, one of the guys who's wounded,
James Madison.
no! James Monroe was the guy who was wounded. James Monroe.
I'm so happy about it.
Who is this guy?
There went that attaboy.
Oh man, okay, so James Monroe was the guy who actually was wounded, and the report, the account says that actually a artery was nicked. The doctor was able to be there to save his life from bleeding out. And so there's accounts from Monroe and the doctor. I mean, very providential in the situation, but it wasn't just us looking back that saw the providence, because one of the officers who was there actually acknowledged the providence of God. Now, you might want to just read that name.
Henry Knox.
Okay.
Right here, General Henry Knox. We spoke about him a little bit earlier on Wednesday, but he's there. He actually describes the battle scene as not unsimilar to like the last Trump. So talking about, some biblical language there. But afterwards, looking back on it, he says that Providence seemed to have smiled upon every part of this enterprise, because it was such, like you've been mentioning, it was such a unbelievably difficult task to go in the middle of winter, in the middle of a blizzard, across a halfway frozen river.
But see, here's the thing too. Had not it been such a rough time with all that storm and hail,
The sentries.
if the sentries had been out there, your casualty rate goes through the roof undoubtedly. And so from the American side, when it's happening, you think, how can it get any worse? You guys don't understand. This is going to save a whole bunch of your lives. This is going to be for your good.
Give you an idea, just another modern example. When Hurricane Isabel hit the D.C. area, the one time, I think it's the only time I know of, that the sentries at the Tomb of the Unknown were allowed, they didn't take the opportunity, but they were allowed to leave their post because a Category 1 hurricane is coming up the Chesapeake. That's the kind of weather you're describing here. It may not be a hurricane, but I mean, that's a severe weather event that the austerity that those soldiers are enduring is what you have to have in the sense of dedication to purpose and service.
And you understand the Hessian position, thinking nobody's crazy enough to attack in this weather.
They've never fought Americans before.
Well, and you're already in that point because of the enlistments expiring on December 31st. If that were not the case, in this time of the early Napoleonic Wars, you would have been in winter quarters.
Yes.
Because it was the gentleman's agreement to go to ground in the winter, and then we'll fight, resume fighting in the spring. Washington didn't have that option because of the enlistments that were going to expire.
It's just another one of those things where that God's hand showed up at a time that, looking back historically, because at the time, it was not obvious to them all the things that were happening. Knox looked back at it and said that was really providential. Providence seems to have smiled on every part of this. And that's one of the fun things about history, is you can look back and see where God showed up and what a difference it made.
And this is something, too, that we have a new book hopefully coming out this summer called The American Story, that we actually document and go through many of these battles. And what's cool for us is not just that we can look back and say that God did something cool here. What's cool for us is that we can actually point to historical records where that guys who were there say, look at what God did. Look at these providential moments. We actually made a T-shirt with a picture of Washington crossing the Delaware. At the bottom it says the original surprise party. Right, this is how we celebrated Christmas early in America. So there are some cool things we have to kind of help tell some of that story. But The American Story is a book we have coming out this summer where we walk through so many moments in American history where it was evident that God showed up, that God's providence was real. And this is just one of the cool things that we get to enjoy studying American history.
Hi, I'm David Barton.
And I'm Tim Barton, and we want to invite you to our yearly Pro-Family Legislators Conference held in Dallas, Texas.
We have legislators that come together from across all 50 states to Dallas, and we look at usually about a dozen issues that are hot issues for that year. We bring in national experts to provide great expertise on the things that you'll need to know when you get back to face that issue in your session.
We encourage you to click on the link to find more information about our Pro-Family Legislators Conference, as well as once you're there, you've seen this is a great deal. We encourage you to register, and we look forward to seeing you in Dallas in November. Inside the Jefferson Memorial, there are 5 inscriptions, 5 things that were considered the most significant writings or statements he ever said. And of those 5, in 3 of them, he talks about God. On April 13th, 1743, Thomas Jefferson was born. And exactly 200 years later, FDR opened up the Jefferson Memorial.
Today, in the midst of a great war for freedom, we dedicate a shrine to freedom. The words which we have chosen for this memorial speak Jefferson's noblest and most urgent meaning, and we are proud indeed to understand it and share it. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man.
Now, Jefferson today is a guy that certainly we wouldn't think of honoring or paying homage to, but in previous generations, he was largely honored. Now, today, Jefferson is a very controversial guy, whether it's his faith or many things surrounding his life. What's interesting, though, is if you ever go to the Jefferson Memorial, inside the Jefferson Memorial, there are 5 inscriptions, 5 things that were considered the most significant writings or statements he ever said. And of those 5, in 3 of them, he talks about God. The 4th one is actually from the Declaration, where he talks about that we have a divine creator, and from that creator we have rights. 4 times Jefferson acknowledges a God figure, which seems like a lot for someone who's considered one of the least religious founding fathers. But what's significant about it is Jefferson actually, and one of the things from his notes in the state of Virginia, it's one of the statements that appears in the Jefferson Memorial. He says, "Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we've removed the conviction that these liberties are the gift of God?" Now, one thing that Jefferson was very clear about is that our rights come from God. In a nation that is filled with thinking that we need the government to give us rights and the government to do things for us, what the founding fathers and Thomas Jefferson specifically made very plain is our rights come from God.
You were recently telling a story that we don't hear much about, which is a story about women, and particularly young women. Tell us about that from early American history.
Yeah, there's some great stories about young women, and one of them involves these 2 writings right here. Hi, I'm David Barton.
And I'm Audria Decker.
Audria runs a really great group, and she does great stuff in engaging young people and telling the stories of young people. It's really good stuff. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here. You were recently telling a story that we don't hear much about, which is a story about women, and particularly young women, from early American history.
Yeah, there's some great stories about young women, and one of them involves these 2 writings right here. Now, these are not young women. You can see one says I'm 85 and the other one says I'm 81. Abby was about 15 at the time. So these 2 girls were the daughters of a keeper of a lighthouse on the coast there in Massachusetts. And the story involves the War of 1812. And in 1814, the British were coming to invade their town in Massachusetts. And as the British got close, the girls saw the British unloading off the ships and sending ships of soldiers ashore. And they knew there's no way the militia is going to get there in time to face the British and be able to save the town. So these 2 girls, they did something really cool. They went and got fife and drum. And fife and drums back then, that's how you marched the troops. You had the fife and drums. And so the girls hid themselves behind some bushes where the British couldn't see them. And they started playing Yankee Doodle and started playing through the military marches. And the British go, "Oh my gosh, they're coming." The British got in the boats, turned around, went back on the ship and left. So these 2 young girls saved the town from the British.
Creativity, right
Creativity.
there.
Instantaneous, on the spot. It was brilliant stuff.
So we often hear about the presidents or the generals, people really famous in history, but it's not often that we hear about average people who did really historic things. That's one of the things that we love about Wall Builders is we get to learn and hear those stories.
Yeah, there really are a lot of really good stories, and we're going to keep telling those stories, including this story of the Army of 2.
We've not been before. Man, we are blown away. Tour last night changed my life. It's changed my prayer life. I can tell you I'm going to be praying different.
the history that we have learned that our children and ourselves have been deprived of for so many years. It is so important that our country knows the history that we have, and the Christian perspective of that history has been paramount. We have learned so much.
To hear the heart of America and God and our senators and congressmen, very, very moving. I would say to all the pastors in my town, do this before you do anything else.
So the pastor's briefing is a transformational event. It will give you hope. Nothing on TV you see like this will ever give you this kind of hope. It will cause you to have a different view of what's going on around you and what God's doing in the country. So if you're a pastor, we encourage you to come be here. It is a life-changing event.
And if you're not a pastor, we encourage you to invite your pastor. Because as you've seen, this really is something incredibly impactful, incredibly transformative, and we want to get as many pastors there. So if you're not a pastor, invite your pastor to come and be a part. You can find out more information on wallbuilders.com. Go to our website, all kinds of information about this pastor's briefing. But we invite you to come and be a part. If you're a pastor, we want to see you there. If you're not a pastor, invite your pastor. We want to help you make a difference.
We're getting new stuff in all the time, and this is something that just arrived. I'm David Barton, and I'm here with Jonathan Ritchie, who's one of the researchers we have here at Wall Builders. And we're getting new stuff in all the time, and this is something that just arrived. What do we got here?
So this is a pennant from the 10th U.S. Cavalry, commonly known as the Buffalo Soldiers. They were started in 1866, right after the Civil War. It was an integrated division of cavalry, and they went all the way up until 1944, I think. And this specific pennant is from 1916, so this was right before they were sent to Mexico on the punitive expedition.
Oh, Pancho Villa.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
all
right.
The movies on Pancho Villa, sure.
And so one of the things that's really cool about this artifact is right over here, where it's got "I love you" surrounding the American flag. And that's just super incredible because these guys who went through slavery on the tail end and who dealt with so much oppression saw that flag not as something that represented their oppression, all the hardships they went through, but that represented the opportunity of freedom and liberty that they had in store for them.
So that's why it's so much fun to have these new things come in and the lessons they represent. And we've got so many more videos out there as well. You can go to any of our social media platforms and see all the other stuff we've got. This is just one more fun piece we've added to the collection.
Hey guys, at Wall Builders, we have a new product line of t-shirts. Actually, a few different kinds. So on the one Jonathan's sporting, it's actually a Frocket front pocket. On the back, it has Washington crossing the Delaware. It says the original surprise party because, hey, on Christmas back then, we actually surprised the Hessians. Hey, we're here, and we won. Also, we have a Squad Goals t-shirt, which is names of founding fathers. We also have a couple other Wall Builders t-shirts, and actually on the gray one, on the back, it has the Bible verse upon which Wall Builders is based, so you can find out more about that. If you want to have a Wall Builders t-shirt, if you want to support that, or just have a fun t-shirt, go to wallbuilders.com for more.
The inauguration of George Washington. That inauguration, it set the stage for everything that was to follow with the federal government. So they want that to be very successful. And how do you set the stage and how do you set the tone? And what do you do to start something that's never been done before? Well, what they did was the first activity of the inauguration was that they called the city of New York to come pray together. They rang the bells and they asked people to go into churches and pray leading up to the inauguration. Then when the inauguration began, George Washington and the House and the Senate met together. They're in Federal Hall in New York City. And after they opened Congress and George Washington's there, he walks out on the balcony where all the people are watching. And as there on the balcony, he takes the oath of office. Now, he took the oath of office required by the Constitution and he added the phrase, "So help me God." And that phrase was required by state law in many of the states, but it wasn't in the Constitution, but Washington put that as part of his oath. Next, he took an oath on the Bible, which was open to Genesis 49. And then after he took the oath on the Bible, according to this newspaper, which is a newspaper from the inauguration 1789, it says that he leaned over and kissed the Bible, showing his respect and reverence for God's Word. He then began his address to the people below, his inaugural address, the first inaugural address in American history, and he started with offering a prayer himself. And then he asked the people to pray. And once he finished his inaugural address, the next thing they did, the House and the Senate and the President, they had a parade. But not like we have today, because they had a parade that led to church. They all went to church together, and when they got into church, the chaplain of the Senate, the Reverend Samuel Provost, he preached a sermon, he taught from the Bible, they had Bible lessons, they had prayer, and they had worship. And then after they finished that church service, they all marched back to Federal Hall, where they go into Congress and they closed the inauguration. And that inauguration was filled with religious activities, and this is how our nation began.
My name is Elijah O'Neill. I am 20 years old. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. They should come to this program if they love truth, if they love the idea of upholding principles and the principles that made this nation great. The scripture in Proverbs that talks about, he who walks with the wise will become wise, but the companion of fools suffers much harm. And I think about Tim Barton and David Barton on how these men are super wise, and for 2 weeks I've had the chance to walk with them as they show me history using primary source documents. And not only do they have an abundance in knowledge, but they have an abundance in wisdom, because they've understood how to apply that knowledge. And being able to come here and learn from them has just been an incredible experience. It's something I'm going to take with me the rest of my life, and it's just made me more valiant and braver to stand up for what I know is right, because I know truth. I would tell people to come because truth is worth it. Truth is something that is not easily found in this generation, and it's here. And so if you are a believer in Christ, if you want your faith reaffirmed or strengthened, come here because it will teach you how to be a warrior for Christ.